Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, what's up? So it's always weird for me doing these from my room and again talking head videos, but you guys don't seem to mind. You seem to listen to them. You seem to enjoy the information. You seem to reply well. So nothing wrong with doing them from time to time, right? So getting into some questions today from social media. I have a question here from New Zealand. I'm not entirely sure how to say that screen name, so I'm not even going to try. I'll just read the question. It is a very long and detailed question, and I'm happy to answer it to the best of my ability. Hi, Alan. I very recently made a bourbon mash with 10 pounds of corn, 2.73 pounds of malted rye, and 1.7 pounds of two-row distiller's malt, which made a 6.6 gallon mash. I wanted to make a 75%, 13%, 12% mash, and I'm a beginner, so learned along the way. I used 3.5 milliliters of amylase and glucanase in the ferment. I did things ass about face and fermented on the grain and ended up with 1.067, which went down to 0.950 for about 14%. Then I realized that 14% is way too high for a double pot still run and ended up adding water and sparge the grain to get the alcohol out to make roughly 10 to 11 gallons of wash and let it set and clear for 4 days. I tested the wash with a refractometer and got between 7 and 8% ABV. I've run it down and collected tails down to about 5%, and have somewhere between 20 and 25% ABV in my low wines. The smell coming off the distillate was amazing to me as a newbie. It smelled like chicken stock or grain feed in my opinion. After setting, it smells and tastes slightly sweet and of corn/grain. I'm going to duplicate the wash to collect enough low wines to make a spirit run on a pot still. Apart from making my life hard, do you think I compromise the quality by doing this in such an unconventional way? How did the old timers convert the corn with such a low amount of enzyme available in a 75% corn mash? Was the corn malted? Here in New Zealand, we can only get two-row, and the linter is low. Gladfeld's quotes 260 WK or 78.9 linter for the two-row distiller's malt, so making this mash without enzymes would be near impossible. Cheers, Kyle. All right, so a couple things, Kyle. First of all, your ABV was a little high. But honestly, you wouldn't have heard anything to have distilled it that way. I know that as I've said on the channel many times, between 7, 8, 9%, sometimes even up to 10% alcohol is what I aim for. But even at 14, you would have been okay. You might have had a little harsher spirit, but it's not going to hurt anything. And there's nothing wrong with adding water to it to dilute it down, sparging it, etc. When it comes to bourbon, if you have the ability to ferment on grain, and particularly if you have the ability to ferment on grain and distill on grain, all the better, because that is the preferred method of making bourbon here in the United States. So nothing wrong with any of that. If anything, I know you're using exogenous enzymes, and one thing I always sort of prescribe to people who are getting into this or who are using enzymes, or when I do consults and they have some issues, I always tell them to take those exogenous enzymes and cut them back to about 90% efficiency, because what happens at 100% efficiency is you start converting certain starches into sugars that are fermentable that ordinarily would not have traditionally have been fermentable, and they may give some off flavors. For me, when I start seeing negative specific gravities, I start knowing that my enzymes are working too efficiently. I always try to end out at no lower than 1.000 as much as possible. That's just a quality issue on my end that I pay attention to, and I caught it in here and I wanted to mention it to you. You got exactly what you should have as far as your ABV goes with your low wines, and your smell, that corn. And almost, it's ironic that you mentioned the where was it, the chicken stock, right? So very much so, that's exactly what you should be getting off of a White Dog bourbon. Maybe some diacetyl, like some buttered movie popcorn, right? That's the other big note that you're going to get off of that. In regards to your question about how the old timers did this, so there's a few different ways, and it kind of depends on time range and region. So first and foremost, one thing that I think one of the big differences between modern bourbon and rye and multiple other grain distillates that are out there and pre-prohibition, and even you go back before that, late 1800s whiskeys, you could look at those, and one of the big differences, I think, and it's one of the things that I never see the armchair quarterbacks and people who aren't distillers but who are reviewers ever comment on, is that those fermentations were not efficient, and they very rarely ever finished. They almost always would finish out at 1.010, 1.015, right? A little residual sugar and or starch left behind. That's left in the, you know, the matrix of what's being stripped and the stripping still, and subsequently there's some aromatic factors that come across as aromatics in that stripping run and are held onto in the doubling run. 90% of what you taste is in what you smell, and subsequently those inefficient fermentations, in my opinion, make a qualitatively better whiskey than completely efficient fermentations do. That's just me. I'm sure there's people out there that are going to argue otherwise, but from my view, historically looking from back then coming forward, that's one of the very, very big differences. So most distillers in the late 1700s, early 1800s that were making whiskey, if they had access to barley malt, they mostly had access on the East Coast to two-row brewer's malt that they were getting from the brewers. Same inefficiency issues you're running into there in New Zealand, getting the two-row malts, right? Six-row malts in the U.S. didn't become a thing until more like the mid-1800s, and that was really more of a Midwest, kind of Mid-South. A lot of it was being grown down in Tennessee. It was adapted from beer barley from northern Scotland, and it did have a higher diastatic power, and it was much more efficient. It became more common as you got into the industrial age, and you got larger farmers growing more and more of that stuff and putting it out there. Some of the old distillers, especially with corn whiskey and or what you would have called bourbon early on, bourbon not really being used as a term until about 1823 or so, all bourbon really having its roots as corn whiskey. Some early distillers did malt all of their corn or the vast majority of their corn. I know here in southern Indiana in the 1800s, especially the early 1800s, one of the very common varieties of whiskey that you would run into was 100% corn whiskey. And it was 100% malted corn whiskey because they didn't have, you know, the exogenous enzymes to use to convert that starch into sugar. Corn has a very low diastatic power. If you malt it fairly efficiently, it does have just enough diastatic power at 100% corn malt to basically convert itself, although not always 100% completely. So you are on the right track with your thinking with what the old timers were doing. More commonly, a lot of the old timers were actually malting their rye, and interestingly enough, even raw rye has some small amount of enzyme to it to convert starch into sugar. As well, rye is an interesting crop because the old-fashioned ryes that they would have had in the 1800s that they would have been using for their bourbon, mash bills, etc., even when they're harvested well, they were 6, 7, 8 foot tall ryes. And here in the Midwest and in the South, they ripen in June. Well, what also happens in June? We get storm systems early in the year. It gets that rye wet, and some of it even germinates, even just slightly, not completely, but slightly on the stalk, raising the diastatic power. So even the raw rye, quote unquote, had some diastatic power to it. And when it didn't, oftentimes they would actually malt their own rye. It was very rare, if you go back and you look at some of the old still patents from the 1800s, that you didn't see a still furnace, that the backside of that furnace in some way, shape, or form either led to a room or to a rack of some sort for drying malt specifically for your whiskey production, whether that be corn malt, rye malt, or in a rare case that you were making your own barley malt. So you are on the right track, and qualitatively you did nothing wrong. You're headed exactly where you need to be headed at, and the next time I'll just use those enzymes a little less efficiently, and maybe aim your mash bill to be more like a 1075 mash bill, right? To where you're not getting those very high ABVs, right? You're getting enough to make it worthwhile to run the still and make it efficient, but not so much that you might have a little hotter liquors. So hope that answers your question. And guys, if you would, check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Go to the store. If you feel so inclined, buy some of our merchandise. All that money goes right back into this program and the If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything program. And check out Distillers Talk. We just had Wayne Herbert of Ozark Stillworks on there. You're going to be seeing a lot of Wayne stuff here on the channel. The Shocker Deflator, which you guys have seen once already, and what we're currently calling the Mr. Fusion, which is the pot still head with a deflator on the inside. We've got a side-by-side cranberry and oat sugar shine mash that we're going to run single pass on both those setups and see how they compare. So love y'all. Catch you later.